In the early 1980s, Peru entered a period of violence that official reports simply labeled an internal armed conflict between the state and several guerrilla groups, the most extreme being the Communist Party of Peru, Shining Path, a Maoist organization born in the Andean region of Ayacucho. The reality was that Andean villages were burned, power pylons were blown up, and bodies were left on cold dirt roads. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission finished its work, nearly 70,000 people had been killed or had disappeared, and more than half of them were victims of the guerrilla forces that claimed to be fighting in the name of the people. What haunts Peruvians is not only the numbers, but the question: how could a movement that waved the banner of liberation turn its guns on the very peasants, the very Quechua-speaking indigenous people? How could a war that began in the poor valleys around Ayacucho spread all the way to the brightly lit streets of Lima, where the middle class once thought war was something that happened somewhere else? If you trace the trail back, at the starting point, you do not find a commander in uniform, but a philosophy lecturer. He quoted Kant and Marx and then concluded that history needed a violent leap forward, believing that he had the right to write the next chapter with explosives and people's courts. His name was Abimael Guzmán. In this video, Terror Files does not aim to glorify violence, but to dissect how an ideology went from a lectern in Ayacucho to explosions in the middle of Lima and led an entire country to step onto the shining path only to fall into darkness. To understand that, we first have to look at the land that produced him. At that time, Peru was a country divided into many layers. On the map, it was a South American coastal nation with the Pacific Ocean, the Andes, the Amazon rainforest. But in everyday life, it was two very different worlds. A coastal Lima, with government buildings, old universities, newspapers, and cafes in a European style, and an Andean highland region where peasants spoke Quechua, lived in rough brick houses. Terraced fields clung to the mountainsides, and the state only appeared through taxes, conscription, and sometimes repression. Abimael Guzmán was born in 1934 in the Arequipa region of Peru. His mother died early, and he grew up in a family that was not whole, caught between feeling that he belonged and that he stood on the margins. Later, he studied philosophy and law, reading Kant, Hegel, Marx in lecture halls, where most students came from a Spanish-speaking middle class. He saw very clearly the gap between pages that spoke of freedom and equality, and the reality outside on the streets, where street vendors and indigenous people were rarely asked for their opinions. When he accepted a position to teach at the San Cristobal de Huamanga University in Ayacucho, he stepped into a different Peru. Here, most of his students were the children of highland peasants, many of them the first in their families ever to set foot in a lecture hall. They brought with them Quechua accents at home, broken Spanish at school, and a way of life in which land, harvests, and the weather determined the future far more than resolutions did. In their eyes, a professor coming from the city who spoke the language of books and of the authorities could be a rare bridge between two worlds. And Guzmán understood that. He did not only lecture on European philosophy, but tied it to the injustices they were living, to the fact that their land was treated as of little value, to the fact that their voices were treated as noise, not as opinions. Each class gradually became a space where Highland youth heard a very direct message. The problem did not lie in them, but in the system. The problem was not that they were lazy, but that the game was designed to be tilted. In that context, a professor could become the one who gives a name to collective humiliation. And from the moment that humiliation is named, the next question will be, who will step forward to take revenge on history? From a crime file perspective, this is the psychological social groundwork that Guzmán would exploit. A community that was both materially disadvantaged and treated as invisible within the power structure. The next question for any investigative file will be, how did someone like Guzmán turn the classroom into an instrument of his own ambitions? In Ayacucho, Guzmán did not only teach philosophy. He began organizing small after-hours discussion sessions where students and young lecturers sat in a circle around a wooden table, reading Marx and Lenin, then passing around materials about Mao and People's War. They talked about injustice in Peru, about land being taken away, about how highland people were seen as second-class citizens. In those cramped rooms, under weak yellow light, a very strong feeling gradually took shape. The feeling that what was written in the books was not some distant story, but an answer to their own lives. At first, it was still the language of criticism and reform. But gradually, Guzmán pushed the story further. He spoke about the failures of moderate left-wing parties, about the degeneration of the Soviet Union, about how even revolutions that had succeeded had become compromised. In the way he presented things, only one path remained, sounding both simple and absolute. To change something at the root, you had to use violence at the root. To break an unjust system, you could not just make demands, you had to smash it. In a place where young people were already too used to being ignored, that certainty was very seductive. A professor told them that history needed a new center, needed a flashpoint, and that Ayacucho itself, the very people the whole country was forgetting, could become the epicenter of the quake. From then on, his tone changed. Less questioning, more commanding. Less hesitation, more assertions. He did not just quote Mao, he began to speak as if he were continuing Mao's words. Radicalization in this case was not a sudden leap, but a series of very small steps. Here, Guzmán did three things at once. He eliminated debate, turned disagreement into the crime of revisionism, and set himself up as the sole source of truth. That is the familiar framework of every extreme political sect. With each step, Guzmán left behind a part of the philosophical tradition of argumentation and added another part of the language of military orders. Anyone who did not fully agree was branded a revisionist. Anyone who spoke of another path was seen as weak. When a man is looked at by a whole circle of young people with eyes full of expectation, it is very easy for him to believe he is the only one who hears history's voice clearly. By that point, in Guzmán's mind, he was no longer a provincial professor. He was the keeper of a truth that the world had ignored. And if you believe that you alone hold the truth, using bombs, guns, and people's courts to force the world to listen becomes something you can justify. From the fusion of the humiliation of the poor and the pride of an intellectual, an ideology called Gonzalo Thought began to take shape. After his ideology had taken shape, Guzmán began doing something many other professors did not. He stepped out of the role of commentator and placed himself in the role of organizer. From the late 1960s, he and his close allies broke away from the mainstream of the Communist Party and quietly built a new structure called Shining Path. On paper, it was a revolutionary party, but the way it operated resembled a machine in which every gear turned around a single axis: the leader. In Guzmán's vision, war did not begin with tanks, but with one small village at a time. The first cells were planted in the Ayacucho highlands, where the state was weakest and injustice most visible. In the early 1980s, from these very cells, Shining Path began to step out of Ayacucho through attacks on infrastructure and assassinations of local officials. They met peasants in night meetings, talking about unjust taxes, about land being taken, about their children being left behind. At first, it was a promise to replace a distant state with something closer. But attached to that promise was a sealed system of discipline. Anyone who stepped into the inner circle had to obey. Anyone who remained doubtful for too long was treated as an obstacle. Shining Path built its structure in the way Guzmán had learned from books, updated with the instincts of someone who understood rural anger. From a secret central committee, orders were passed down to regional committees and then to village cells. They set up people's courts, where neighbors judged one another under the light of kerosene lamps. They levied taxes, forced young people to join, and threatened anyone who cooperated with the authorities. For the people, the frightening thing was not only the violence itself, but that the violence came from familiar faces, from those who had once sat with them on the church steps, drunk beer together after market day. People's war, as they understood it, meant there was no clear line between the front and everyday life. A village path could become a supply route. Children carrying messages were said to be on duty. Elderly people cooking for the guerrillas were considered to be participating in the revolution. The entire community was pulled into a game whose rules were set by a few people far away. Violence was explained as an inevitable step along the path of history. Each death became a line in an internal victory report. At the top of that structure stood the image of a man referred to by a simple yet absolute title, Chairman Gonzalo. Not everyone saw his face, but his name was present in slogans, in meetings, in oaths. To those who followed him, he was the one who had correctly named their humiliation and pointed to a path. The problem was that this path was paved with the very lives of the people he said he was liberating. That was the moment when a political organization turned into a machine and human beings into fuel. When an organization has turned into a machine, the next question is always how that machine touches concrete everyday life. With Shining Path, the answer lies in places that very few people outside Peru have ever heard of. Villages in the Andes, where Quechua echoes in the market, where the small church and the dirt plaza are the center of the entire community. Lucanamarca is one such name, a village of shepherds and potato farmers, where news from Lima usually arrives late, but rumors about guerrillas and the army arrive very quickly. When some people in the village were seen as too close to the authorities or daring to resist Shining Path's influence, the decision to punish was made. Here, we do not need to describe the scene in detail. It is enough to know that the next morning, families who were used to greeting each other on the way to the well suddenly stood staring at the gaps in the line of people. The church bell, once rung to announce Mass, suddenly became the sound that signaled a list of names that would no longer be answered. What makes people shudder is the message that comes with it. It is not only those accused of collaborating with the state who can die. An entire community can be made to pay if it does not follow the path laid out by a distant leader. When a small mountain village is branded a traitor, it does not just lose people. It loses the sense that if you work hard plowing the fields tomorrow, life will get better. From there, fear spreads along the footpaths, through the market, through nighttime meetings, making other villages understand that only by remaining silent and obedient do they still have a chance to survive. Meanwhile, in Ayacucho and the surrounding areas, the assassinations of community leaders, teachers, and priests also took place according to the same cold logic. Anyone who dared to build any other form of power, whether a peasant association or a parish group, could be labeled an obstacle. Shining Path claimed to strike at structures of oppression, but in reality, it also struck at the rare seedlings of self-protection that the poor had. For Lima, for many years, the war was still something that happened on the television screen, in unfamiliar place names, until one night in July 1992, on Tarata Street in the Miraflores district. It was a typical middle-class neighborhood with balconies full of plants, shops, cafes, people taking an evening stroll after dinner. When two cars loaded with explosives detonated, glass shattered like rain, walls cracked, cars burned down to blackened frames, Those who had thought the conflict belonged only to the highlands suddenly saw it come straight into their living rooms, into their children's bedrooms. From Lucanamarca to Tarata, from a remote little village to a brightly lit street, there is a red thread running through. It is the idea that violence against civilians can be justified as a necessary step in a larger game. Peasants killed in the mountains become a message to the entire region. People out for a walk in Miraflores become a message to the entire capital. When you look at the whole picture, what emerges is not just a list of attacks, but a deliberate strategy to blow up the belief that there is any place left that is safe, that you can stand aside without choosing a side. After the peak years of violence, the war in Peru entered a new phase. Fewer open gunshots, more silent figures watching each other. In Lima, a small unit within the police force was given a mission that people would later call the road to the arrest of the century. They did not pursue with armored vehicles, but by tracking electricity bills, trash bags, and windows that went dark at unusually late hours in a seemingly quiet middle-class neighborhood. On the night of September 12, 1992, after months of surveillance, the special unit stormed a house in the Circuito district of Lima, not in deep jungle, not on a mountaintop, but right in the capital. Inside, they found Abimael Guzmán and several key leaders of Shining Path. The arrest took place with almost no gunfire, bringing to an end a manhunt that many Peruvians had thought they would never see concluded. In remote mountain regions, the news arrived by radio, by the village's shared television set. Many families of victims sat in front of the screen, looking at the face of the man they blamed for years of loss, trying to guess whether, from this point on, the violence would really recede. The trials that followed were held under tight security. The image of Guzmán in prison clothes, standing in an iron cage, raising his fist and shouting revolutionary slogans, created a deafening disconnect. In his eyes, he was still the leader of a grand historical project. In the eyes of those who had lost loved ones, he was just a man refusing to acknowledge that his ideals had crushed the very communities he claimed to want to liberate. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and later received additional sentences for attacks such as Tarata. In his final years, Guzmán died in prison, far from Ayacucho, far from the lecture halls, far even from the mountain villages that had once been his People's War battlefields. But capturing a man does not mean capturing the shadow he leaves behind. After the arrest, Shining Path weakened markedly. Many branches broke apart. Some members laid down their arms. Others shifted into organized crime in remote jungle areas. The violence diminished, but in many places, the fear never fully disappeared. People still had to live with the memory of years when the rules of the game could change overnight. Official reports can mark the end of the conflict with a year and a line on the page. For the families of the victims, every time they see Guzmán's image again on a screen, whether in an iron cage or in an obituary, the old question returns. How can one man believe that history owed him so much that he was entitled to turn an entire country into a laboratory for violence? When the name Abimael Guzmán only appears in the news as an elderly prisoner who has passed away, many people want to believe that the story has closed. But in the regions that once shook under bombs, memory does not disappear along with a name. It lives in the way people lock their doors, in the way parents tell their children to avoid a certain road, in the silence that falls whenever someone mentions those years. Before we close, it needs to be stated clearly. This Terror Files video is only intended to analyze and acknowledge the victims, not to promote or glorify any organization or act of violence. A country may have reports hundreds of pages long, may have stone memorials, but the hardest question remains. How can we recognize earlier those promises that sound so beautiful, that speak of liberation and justice, yet place ideals above the lives of the people sitting around the table. From Terror Files' perspective, Abimael Guzmán is not only a guerrilla leader, but an extreme example of what happens when a person believes that history owes them and that everyone else can become a sacrifice. If you want Terror Files to keep dissecting formulas like this, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and leave a comment about the detail in this story that haunts you the most, so that every time a new, shining path is promised, we can recognize earlier the signs that are leading straight into darkness